Okay, welcome. Today, essentially, what we're going to go ahead and cover is our proposal for the effects of ketogenic, cyclic ketogenic, and targeted ketogenic dieting combined with training on body composition, muscle mass, performance, and molecular signaling in maintenance, deficit, and caloric surplus conditions. This will be performed over a 2-year period. My name is Dr. Jacob Wilson. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Health Sciences and Human Performance, and I'm along with my colleague Ryan Lowry, also in the Human Performance Lab at University of Tampa. So as a background, ketosis is a metabolic state in which the liver produces small organic molecules called ketone bodies, such as acetone, acetate, as well as BHB. And while a lot of studies have shown the efficacy of ketogenic dieting in conditions such as epilepsy, cancer, other neurological disorders, as well as in sedentary people looking to lose weight or positively impact their blood lipid profile, to date, research on ketogenic dieting combined with exercise is limited. Some of the first research that was done with performance was performed by Dr. Steve Phinney. And what Steve Phinney found is that if you place people on a ketogenic diet, which is about 75% fat, 5% carbohydrates, the rest filled in with protein, he found that if you do endurance exercise, his model was specifically a time to exhaustion trial, that initially from pre-values to 1 week in, performance went down. But after 6 weeks, performance actually increased. So this is very important to understand, is that there's a period of time needed to what Phinney coined keto adapt. This is what keto adaptation essentially is. Venables in 2005 took people and had them run and looked at the maximal amount of fat that they could oxidize per hour. The lowest participant was able to use 11 grams per hour. The average was about 30 grams an hour. And the highest participant was 60 grams of fat per hour. So Venables essentially concluded that, well, that is the maximal amount of fat we can use in an hour's time. And we see that there. Now, if you look over, Phinney in 83 did another study where he took endurance athletes and keto adapted them. And after keto adaptation, the lowest participant was able to use more fat than the highest participant in the Venables study. That is keto adaptation, where essentially you are using fat as your primary source of fuel, and hence why we see the increase in performance in the previous study. Now, with resistance training, we have even less data than we actually have for endurance exercise. This is a study that was done in sedentary individuals by Jeff Volek. And what Volek did was he took people, he placed them on a calorie deficit, and he put them in a low-fat group with a calorie deficit, and they lost about 2% body fat. Then he put them on a low-carb ketogenic diet, and without exercise, they lost about 3.5% body fat. Then he took the low-fat group and had them resistance train. They lost 3.5% body fat, which was equal to the low-carb group that didn't train. And when you combine low carbohydrates plus resistance training, fat loss was greatest. So this indicates that basically ketogenic dieting places you in a unique metabolic state in which you're using fat as your primary source of fuel, which allows you to lose more body fat than you normally would on a low-fat diet. Now, we have almost no data in trained individuals until really recently. Paoli basically took elite gymnasts and divided them to where half of them were placed on a ketogenic diet for 30 days and the other half on the carbohydrate diet. So basically these researchers examined body composition as well as strength and performance. And if you look here at body weight, Body weight went down. The black group is the before group. You see very low carb ketogenic dieting to your left, and then very low carb ketogenic dieting post. Lost body weight. That's graph A. Whereas the Western stayed the same. And if you look at what happened, body fat went down in the ketogenic dieting group, but not the Western group. So they lost body fat. However, there were no significant differences that were detected in all performance measures. This is the first study that essentially indicated that ketogenic dieting does not adversely affect strength performance, while simultaneously creating a unique metabolic state that actually causes a decrease in fat mass, even in lean individuals. Some of the limitations of the study are there were no controlled training program in this study, only 30 days in length, and the sample size was small. Okay, but it was still a really good introductory study, but we need controlled trials. So our lab performed brand new research, and we were fortunate enough to have funding from you, from Quest Nutrition. So without that, this couldn't have been possible. So we teamed up with expertise of Dr. D'Agostino and Jeff Volek and performed this study at the University of Tampa. We looked at the impact of ketogenic dieting using a resistance training model in resistance trained athletes, something that hadn't been done before. So one thing to point out here, what we did is we took 24 resistance trained guys. We divided them into either a ketogenic or Western diet group, and they were placed on maintenance calories. So again, these were resistance trained guys, and if you look here, basically the study was an 11-week study. At week 0, we took baseline measures, and then we began one of 2 diets. Several studies will say they put people on a ketogenic diet, but they don't confirm ketosis. And what you see is the graph below, and what you're looking at is after 2 weeks of keto adaptation, through the whole ketogenic dieting period is what's highlighted there. We took ketosis to be defined as 0.3 millimolars of blood ketones. And if you look after 2 weeks, we see that individuals are in ketosis by that definition. As you go deeper into the study, the ketogenic group is the black squares, the Western diet is the open squares. You see that essentially the blood ketone levels go up and up. So we confirm ketosis. Now, week 3, we began training, and they trained then for 8 weeks. Then at week 10, we reassessed all measures and essentially began a reintroduction phase of carbohydrates. So we carved them up, we switched them back to a Western diet, and at week 11, we reassessed all the measures. So if you look at the results here at lean body mass, basically we have strength training plus ketogenic dieting, which is STKD, right? And then what we have is ST plus WD, which is strength training plus Western dieting. So the closed bars are the keto, the open bars are the Western. So you see baseline, no differences in lean mass. You see post 10 weeks, they both went up in lean mass significantly. And so this is what I'm highlighting here. And then you see that post 11 weeks, the ketogenic dieting group, especially after glycogen was full, actually had more lean mass than the actual standard Western diet. Okay, let me show you what happened here. This is the values, the change in values after week 1 through 10. So it appears that basically if we're looking at weeks 1 through 10, this is again from baseline to the end of training, it appears that the Western group had gained a little more lean mass than the keto group. However, what I want to point out is that at week 0, the keto group was in a glycogen repleted state. So they had a lot of muscle glycogen. But after 10 weeks of ketogenic dieting, their glycogen is going to be less, which is going to make lean mass look smaller, which is why we reintroduce carbohydrate. If we look at reintroduction of carbohydrate, once their muscle glycogen was full, and you can compare both groups on lean mass, it was actually higher in the ketogenic group. So this is very interesting. We postulate part of that could be glycogen supercompensation increasing lean mass, But the main point is that ketogenic dieting either has a beneficial effect on lean mass compared to Western, and definitely Western is not better than keto. So that's the positive. But some of the negatives we saw was this. Or let's look at fat mass here real quick. If you look at weeks 1 through 10, the ketogenic group, which is a black group, lost more fat than the Western group. They lost about 4 kilograms of fat mass compared to the Western group, which is only 2. However, when we reintroduced carbohydrates, the keto group was rapidly accumulating fat mass. Now, this poses a concern to us. It posed a big concern. And on top of that, we saw that there were no negative impacts on blood lipid profile throughout weeks 0 to 10. In fact, HDL tended to go up. However, after we reintroduced carbohydrates, triglyceride levels began to go up. So what this is telling us is it points to a number of really important questions that we have. One, again, first off, fat mass increases in the carb up, and carving up has a negative effect on blood lipid profile. Also, I want to point out one of the positives on blood lipid profile, though, was that testosterone went up by about 100 points. So based on these studies, we have a lot of unanswered questions. Clearly we see that ketogenic diet can be efficacious for lean mass. If you don't reintroduce carbohydrates, it's beneficial for fat mass, and it has favorable effects on hormone status and blood lipid profile. So some of our unanswered questions include this. One, what is the efficacy of cyclic or intermittent ketogenic dieting strategies? So instead of carving up for a week, people will normally carve up for like 2 days, or we were talking to Ron at the expo at the Mr. Olympia about another type of ketogenic dieting, which is targeted, where essentially you have the carbohydrates just around the workout. So, but no one's tested this. So maybe with shorter bouts, you stay fat adapted and you don't get any of the negative effects. We don't know to this point. We have to test that. Our next question is, how do glycogen levels adapt to long periods of training while on ketogenic dieting? Then we're interested in the anabolic and adipose signaling responses to ketogenic dieting. What happens in those tissues when you're resistant training ketogenic dieting? What happens with protein synthesis? What are the molecular protein signaling pathways that are turned on or off by ketogenic dieting? And how does ketogenic dieting impact your response to a bolus of amino acids, such as leucine or branched-chain amino acids? Is there an impact of the degree of ketosis on performance? And how does ketone ester supplementation work in athletes? Also, our last study was in a calorie maintenance phase, but several individuals want to lose weight when they're training, so they have a caloric deficit. Several individuals are trying to put on size, but one of the repercussions of that is an increase in fat mass. So we're going to look at calorie surplus and deficit conditions while resistance training on a ketogenic diet. And finally, what has not been looked at is psychomotor performance or strength endurance. So what we're going to do is provide an overview of these studies. This is the timeline of our proposal over the funding period. You see that we have studies running from spring 2015, summer 2015, fall 2015, spring 2016, summer 2016, and fall 2016. So the studies in the spring are the cyclic versus Western dieting group. We're also going to look at the impact of the rate of carbohydrate reintroduction on fat mass and blood lipid profile. In summer 2015, we'll look at cyclic versus ketogenic dieting with and without an adaptation period on the ability to return to a ketogenic state. We'll also look at the effects of supplemental ketone ester supplementation on repeated sprint ability and the acute effects of Western versus ketogenic dieting on protein synthesis. In the fall, we'll look at the effects of ketogenic targeted dieting versus ketogenic dieting on body composition, strength, and hormonal profile. We'll also look at the effects of ketogenic diet on strength endurance and buffering capacity, as well as the acute effects of ketone ester supplementation on skeletal muscle protein synthesis and anabolic signaling. In 2016, we'll look at the impact of ketogenic versus Western dieting overfeeds on body composition during resistance training, the effects of ketogenic dieting on resting energy expenditures and metabolic parameters, as well as glycogen storage capacity, resynthesis, and adipocyte signaling following 6 weeks of resistance training and ketogenic dieting. In summer of 2016, we'll look at the effects of ketogenic dieting on psychomotor performance, and in the fall, to end the funding period, we'll look at the impact of ketone ester supplementation on body composition, strength, and health parameters. We'll also look at the impact of ketogenic dieting following a period of calorie restriction. So let's discuss this. This is an overview on these studies. Here we're going to look at ketogenic dieting versus cyclic versus Western, and it'll be a very similar design to our previous studies, except we're going to create a calorie deficit in this study. Well, again, we will have essentially baseline measures. People will be placed on a ketogenic diet, a cyclic, or a Western. Week 2, they'll confirm ketosis, and then they'll begin training. We'll give them a 500 calorie deficit, and we're going to look at all the measures that we normally look at: body composition, strength, hormonal profile. At the end of week 6, we will reassess. So we'll see what is best for muscle mass and fat loss between these diets. In spring of 2015, one thing we found in our last study was when we reintroduced carbs, we saw those negative impacts on blood lipid profile and fat mass. But one thing we don't know is what's the difference between the rate of reintroduction and when do these negative impacts occur. So what we're going to essentially do is, after ketogenic dieting these individuals for 8 weeks, we're going to reintroduce carbohydrates slowly with 1 gram per kilogram per day, or rapidly, 3 grams per kilogram. And we are going to essentially assess fat accumulation from the moment of reintroduction of carbohydrates all the way out for a week. So we'll actually end up seeing when actually, quote, spillover becomes. So that's very, very important. And then following that, we'll take the individuals and get their final measures on body comp as well as blood lipid profile. In summer, we'll begin actually looking at what is the impact of an adaptation period. Most people, when they go into cyclic ketogenic dieting, do so immediately. But we know it takes weeks, maybe months, maybe even years to really keto adapt. So what's going to happen is we're going to test whether it's efficacious to enter into a ketogenic diet purely and strictly for 2 weeks and then go cyclic, or if you can just go straight into cyclic ketogenic dieting and still make the same adaptations. To do this, we'll be looking at blood ketones and resting metabolic rate so that we can determine the calories coming from fat and carbohydrate. So week 0, we'll have baseline measures of metabolic rate, fat oxidation, and carbohydrate oxidation, as well as blood ketones. We'll begin to adapt them. Basically, we'll have one group that is not cyclic at the first 2 weeks, and then one group that immediately goes cyclic. At weeks 2 to 4, we're going to be measuring blood ketones during every day of the week, basically to see that what we're looking for is if we were to essentially have them fully adapt the first 2 weeks, will they more easily get back into ketosis following their weekend carb ups? So is an adaptation period necessary? So at the end of week 4, we're going to retest all their metabolic parameters. We'll reintroduce carbohydrates for 2 days, and we're going to measure, essentially, at the end of the week, blood ketones and test metabolic parameters daily until in ketosis. So again, once we reintroduce carbs and they go back to ketogenic diet, we're trying to see how rapidly they get back into ketosis and how rapidly they become fat adapted again. And that will be using both metabolic measures and ketones. We'll also be looking at the effects of repeated sprintability. What most people don't realize is a lot of my colleagues will discuss the fact that when you do sprints, you're relying on glycolysis, which is true. However, with repeated sprints, you become primarily reliant actually on oxidative capacity. So the first sprint might be primarily glycolytic, but as you move forward, it actually switches so you're primarily oxidative. So the point is, repeated sprintability is the ability to maintain power output from one sprint to the next. That is the key variable underlying so many different sports. What we're going to do in this study is have a Western diet, we'll have a ketogenic diet, and we'll have a ketogenic plus supplemental ketone ester group. And what we hypothesize is going to happen is that the ketogenic group, because of enhanced buffering capacity and enhanced ability to use oxidative capacity, will have more continuous repeated sprint ability than the Western diets, and also less metabolic stress. So we'll be looking at peak power, average power, fatigue, and blood lactate over 10/6 repeated sprints. So again, we'll have week 0, we'll have a 4-week keto adaptation phase, and we'll repeat all the sprinting measures. So also, what we're going to get into is molecular signaling in 2015. We don't know how, essentially, ketogenic dieting impacts protein synthesis. So we will have a model where we adapt rats on either a Western or ketogenic diet for 3 weeks. Then we're going to use a one-legged model where they train one leg while the other leg remains sedentary. And we're essentially going to bolus them with leucine right before the training bout. And at 90, 180, and 240 minutes after the training bout, we're going to assess those rats for protein synthesis directly in the muscle, as well as all the molecular signaling that goes into that, including mTOR signaling, protein breakdown, mitogenic and myogenic signaling during those time points. So no one has looked at the molecular effects of this, and we believe this could have a very large impact on how we view the impact of ketogenic dieting on resistance training adaptations. In the fall, we're going to essentially do a similar study to what we did on our first study with with cyclic, but we're going to do it with targeted. So same study design, except these individuals will be on maintenance diet, and the targeted group will essentially only consume carbohydrates around the workout after an initial keto adaptation 2-week phase. Again, our primary goals are going to be body composition, strength, hormonal, and safety profile. We're also going to be looking at strength endurance and buffering capacity. A lot of people will discuss that resistance training, particularly in a hypertrophy range, is reliant primarily on glycolysis. But just like repeated sprinting, as you continue set after set, you become more and more reliant on oxidative capacity, and your ability to continue and have high volume between one set to the next is going to be related to your ability to buffer things like hydrogen ions. One thing we know about being keto adapted is that you increase essentially your MCT transporters, and essentially that means that you're going to clear out that metabolic stress faster. So we theorize that if you do traditional hypertrophy, which is around 60% of your 1RM, and you only have 60 seconds rest between sets, that you actually perform more sets, more repetitions each set than the people who are not keto adapted. And that is absolutely critical when we're talking about actually training for hypertrophy. In fall 2015, we're also going to look at the impact of ketone ester supplementation on skeletal muscle protein synthesis. My brother, Dr. Gabriel Wilson, did a study where essentially they found that after a meal, at about 180 minutes following a meal, you went refractory. Even though amino acids were still available in the blood, you were no longer synthesizing proteins. And what Dr. Gabe Wilson found essentially was that in the muscle, AMP levels were super high, which is indicative of impaired energy status in the cell. When Gabe gave a carbohydrate at 150 minutes, it actually reinstated protein synthesis by reinstating the ATP charge of the cell. However, no one has seen if ketones could actually replicate what carbohydrates we know are able to do. And so that's the purpose of this study. We'll have a one-legged exercising model again. We'll bolus the rats with leucine, and we'll look 90, 180, and 240 minutes afterwards. In one condition, we're going to actually give the ketone supplementation. The other group, we won't. Moving to spring 2016, we're going to essentially move on to overfeeding. A lot of individuals actually are trying to put on weight, but we know that one of the negative impacts of trying to put on weight is you gain fat mass. But because ketogenic dieting places you in a state where you preferentially use fat as fuel, it is conceivable that you will not gain as much fat. So we're going to do what we call a bulking or overfeed study where we have 1,500 additional calories a day, either from a ketogenic diet or a Western diet. We'll assess body composition, safety, strength, power, and hypertrophy. One of the things that people discuss all the time is, well, does ketogenic dieting lower metabolism? Well, we're going to test that over 6 weeks. We'll actually assign people to a Western diet, a ketogenic diet, or a cyclic ketogenic dieting while training them. And we'll actually look at changes in substrate metabolism as well as resting caloric expenditure underneath a 500 calorie deficit. So we will actually see what happens between groups on their metabolic rate. We're also going to be looking at glycogen resynthesis and storage capacity. Again, in our human model, we found that when you rapidly switched over to carbohydrates, that had a negative impact on fat synthesis. We want to know when that occurs. And so essentially what we're going to be doing is for 3 days after reintroduction of carbohydrates, after 4 weeks of ketogenic dieting and reintroduction of carbs, we're going to look at what happens to fat synthesis and the molecular signals of fat synthesis in the muscle as well as in adipose itself. So we want to know, when does this happen? If it doesn't happen in the first day, well, that indicates maybe you can do cyclic over short periods of time. If it happens robustly over the first day, that's not as good of a sign for cyclic ketogenic dieting. We're also going to look at how much glycogen after training begins, or after the training period is ended, because Finney showed that in endurance athletes, you still have 50% glycogen, but we don't know what happens in a resistance training model in the muscle. And then, following reintroduction of carbs, we're going to see how long does it actually take to replenish glycogen stores. We're also going to be looking at psychomotor performance in 2016 using our Dynavision apparatus, or the Dynavision apparatus, and we'll do a battery, essentially, a psychomotor test. We're going to have essentially a Western dieting group, a ketogenic dieting group, and a Western plus ketone supplementation group. We'll put them through a battery of tests, including psychomotor tests, simple reaction time, choice reaction time, and visual acuity. And that's going to be after 4 weeks of being keto adapted. So here what we're going to do is look at the impact of how much you're in ketosis. So we'll actually take subjects, we'll divide them into a ketogenic dieting or ketogenic dieting plus ketone supplementation group. We are going to end up training them over several weeks' time. And of course, we're predicting there'll be higher levels of ketones when you supplement with ketones. And we'll look at resting metabolic measures, fat oxidation, safety parameters, strength, and body composition during this time, and see if consuming ketone esters will actually enhance the effects we see with normal ketogenic dieting. Finally, what we're going to look at is, we know that most people can lose weight. The problem is that they can't keep it off. So when someone in America or anywhere diets down, they rebound rapidly. What we're going to do for 4 weeks is we're going to diet rats. We're going to create a large calorie restriction on them. We'll measure body composition and muscle mass. Afterwards, we're going to take what was previously their ad libitum feeding schedules, reintroduce those calories in either the form of a ketogenic or Western diet, and have them on that for 4 weeks, and then we'll measure their body composition again. We're predicting that after the dieting period that you'll have a preferential ability to store fat, but that switching to a ketogenic diet at that time will cause your body to essentially switch its metabolism to preferentially oxidize fat, in which case you should not gain as much fat as you normally do on a rebound period. So in conclusions, we just really want to thank you for your support and all the opportunities that you've given our laboratory and all things that you're doing across the United States and even the world. Because of your support, we have begun to elucidate the impact of ketogenic dieting on resistance training adaptations. However, there are clearly more unknowns than knowns relative to this topic. As such, we believe the next 2 years of research will result in us making great strides towards solving these mysteries. Again, thank you for your support. We've also included a large, extensive document detailing the funding period, the budget, as well as more details on each study, as well as what we've done in our laboratory. We appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll be coming up there soon to visit.